Well, hello, and welcome to episode 21 of Let's Translate Light Novels. As this is episode 21, it is part of a series, so there's a bunch of information about it that you can find in the video description if you're not familiar with this series. We're going to be looking at a section of a light novel now. Today's episode mostly is a dream sequence, so it's very dreamy and somewhat poetic language. So we're going to see how our patrons and my former self translated that. So let's jump right into it. 静かな夜だ。香水がサラサラと優しい音を奏でている。後半に後ろ向きの人影が2つ見えた。しっかりと手を握り合っている。金色の髪をした女と黒い髪の男だ。Alright, so you can see this is all present tense. I mean, a lot of Japanese prose is present tense. But to me, like sections like this and dream sequences often sort of read the same way that they would read in present tense in English prose. Sometimes we switch to present tense in English to sound more poetic or to sound more dream sequency or to sound more surreal or whatever. Or to just show that it's kind of like a different kind of narration. So that's just kind of what I'm seeing right off the bat. Looking at this word for word, shizuka na yoru da, that's Japanese 101 stuff. It's a quiet night. Kosui, if you look at the kanji, it's lake waters. Ga sarasara to, sarasara is the sound effect for like flowing, silky smooth. Yasashii oto o kanadete iru is playing a gentle tune or a gentle noise. So like the soothing rippling of the lake waters is like playing a gentle tune. Kohan ni ushiromuki no. So kohan is the lakeside. Ushiromuki is facing backwards, or like you're seeing the backside of it. Hitokage is silhouettes. Futatsu mieta. So two were seen. We don't know who is seeing these two backsides of silhouettes, but there's two of them by the lakeside, and you can see them from the back. Shikari to te o nigiriatte iru. Shikari to is like firmly, and then te o nigiru is to hold a hand or to grip a hand. And then when you add that auxiliary verb au to the end of a verb, so nigiri au, not just nigiru, nigiriatte iru, it means that like each person is performing the verb to each other. So they are clasping each other's hands. It's not just like one person is clasping the other person's hand. Kiniro no kami is golden hair or golden colored hair. Wo shita onna, so a woman who has golden colored hair, to, and kuroi kami no otoko da, a man with black hair. That's what these two ushiromuki no hitokage, the two backsides of silhouettes. All right, so Patron A translated this as, a still night at a lakeside. Amidst the gentle sound of rippling water, the backs of two figures come into view. A golden-haired woman and a black-haired man, their hands held tight. So note that Patron A did take the approach of like a present tense sort of like a little more surreal, a little more poetic, because we're not sure necessarily like who is observing this. It will become clear in a minute who is observing this, but at the moment it's sort of like there was a star, there was like an asterisk right after the end of the last scene where Talia and her mom like left Ayuru and her mom for good. They're like, we will never see you again because you are an abomination to our clan, and you better run away, by the way, because the rest of the clan is going to kill you. And then there's a star, so like to show an abrupt scene change. So like, who knows where this is happening or who's even seeing this. So I think this was a good choice to make it present tense like this. A still night at a lakeside instead of a silent night. I mean, yeah, Silent Night evokes imagery of Christmas. It is almost Christmas right now. I'm looking at my beautiful Christmas tree with its lights on, and there's snow outside my window. But yeah, still night. I like still for shizukana. Still in this context does kind of mean quiet. Amidst the gentle sound of rippling water, the backs of two figures come. You could have been even more poetic, like to the tune of the gentle, or to the song of the gentle rippling water. But amidst is totally fine. Amidst is also somewhat poetic. Golden-haired woman and a black-haired man, their hands held tight. Notice how it's not like... It's more just like descriptions of things rather than like saying in complete sentences, there was a golden-haired woman and a black-haired man, and their hands were held tight. It's a little like more poetic this way. And I really like this choice. It doesn't have to be done this way, by the way. I just like this choice. It's kind of how I see it in Japanese. Patron B. The night was quiet. So a still night versus the night was quiet. And past tense, note how this sounds in past tense. The sounds of waves lapping on the lake floated gently through the air. That sounds really nice. Lapping on the lake for sarasarato. Floated gently through the air for yasashi oto wo kanadeteiru. You know how in English, literally, it's like they played a gentle tune? It doesn't sound as poetic as floated gently through the air, but it means the same thing, and it uses pretty much the same words. At the water's edge, two figures faced away. Faced away from whom? I mean, it still works, because this is supposed to be somewhat vague. But faced away almost, like at a glance, when I first saw those words, it almost implied that they're facing away from each other. But that's clearly not what this is saying. Hand firmly in hand. So instead of just hand in hand, hand firmly in hand. I like that. Because hand in hand is a very, cliche but poetic phrase. The woman's hair was blonde and the man's was black. Yeah, this works too. Even though it's not the approach I would have taken with it's past tense instead of present tense. And it's slightly more complete sentency. It still has this dreamlike, poetic quality to it. Let's see what Small Sarah did. It is a quiet night. Okay, so Small Sarah chose to do present tense as well. The blue lake is smooth with gentle sounds all around it. It's more like the lake is making the gentle sounds, not that there are gentle sounds. At the edge of the lake, the shadows of two humans can be seen. Shadows is okay. Like hitokage, like kage literally is shadow, but hitokage is more like a silhouette. But the shadows is fine, because, it kind of sounds a little more metaphoric and poetic that way. They are holding hands tightly. Yeah, this is more like present participle, right? Like they are doing this thing versus they do this thing. They are a woman with golden hair and a man with black hair. This works too, and it technically means what it's supposed to mean. It's a little clunky here and there. The blue lake is smooth with gentle sounds all around it is kind of weird. It's like, what does that even mean? And all around it, just all around would be better. Yeah, but I think we all got the idea. Some of us more so than others. Small Sarah not as much as the others, but we all kind of got the idea that this is supposed to be sort of like the last scene was extremely intense, and this is like a little calm down and a little poetic, quiet moment. Next line, 女が一人、湖に近づいていく。その青い水の中に不思議な光が見える。So, 女, the woman, 一人. So, sometimes if you just see the phrase 女が一人 in isolation, it means like there is one woman, but in this case it means the woman alone, like by herself, not with the person who's with her. 湖に近づいていく. She walks closer to the lake. This iku auxiliary verb at the end of chikazuite, it means like she is in the process of doing this verb, and she's like continuing to do this verb. その青い水の中に, so in the blue water, the sono in this case is like the blue water that's close to her, the woman. 不思議な光, a mysterious or a mystical or a surreal, there's so many different ways you can translate fushigi. So this ga mieru thing again, it's not clear like she can see the strange mysterious light, or a strange mysterious light can be seen, or this third party who is watching all of this sees the mysterious light in the blue water. Patron A. The woman approaches the lake alone, staring at a wondrous light shining within the blue water. I like that Patron A just got rid of the whole can be seen thing, because that is rather clunky. If you do leave it like in a passive voice, like can be seen, I don't know, it's a little weird. And note how in the first sentence, like going back, the ga mieru, Patron A translated as come into view. And that's a good way, a smoother way of saying can be seen. Because then you can like leave out the subject, the person who's viewing it, without it sounding so passive. Staring at the wondrous light shining within the blue water. So, shigina, wondrous, yeah, that's a valid translation as well. Again, there's just so many ways. Ethereal would have even worked. Otherworldly, actually. Yeah, I like that. Patron B. The woman approached the edge of the lake. A mysterious light shone forth from the blue water. I like shown forth again instead of from like can be seen. This is a little more like straightforward, a little less flowery. Yeah, in the Japanese, it's not necessarily flowery poetic. It's more just like, it's not the same style of prose as the rest of the narration of this. You can tell that this is a different vibe. And this does have a different vibe as well. Small Sarah, the woman comes closer to the lake by herself. By herself can sound a little strange. Sometimes it can be like, she didn't need help from anybody. She could do it by herself. I don't know. Sometimes it has that connotation to me. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Inside the blue lake, she can see something mysterious shining. Inside the waters would be better than inside the blue lake. And in Japanese, it is blue water, not blue lake. But I think the waters would be a little better sounding. She can see something mysterious shining. So Small Sarah made the choice that Mieru is the woman who is able to see this. And I mean, sure, I'm sure she can see it. Otherwise, she wouldn't be walking over to it. These all work. The next line. 女がその光に手を伸ばす。水の中から何かを取り出した。ちょうど手のひらに入るくらいの貝だ. So there's that long ellipsis before the kai. So we're like hanging, like what is it that she pulls out? And then the very last word it's revealed, it's a shell or a shellfish. So 女が, the woman, その光に手を伸ばす, she reached out to that light. And then 水の中から from inside the water or from the water, 何かを取り出した, she took something out from inside the water. And ちょうど, it was right, just about, 手のひら is your palm of your hand, に入るくらいの, so a thing that can just about fit in the palm of your hand. And then because of the way Japanese grammar is structured, you can put that noun at the end, a kai, it's a shellfish. In English, you would have to say it was a shellfish about the size, like just big enough to fit in the palm of her hand, which is unfortunate that that's kind of the natural way you'd word it in English because you want to reveal that it was a shellfish at the very end of the sentence, not at the beginning. So let's see how everybody handled that. Patron A. A is for airplane, soaring loudly above my apartment as I try to record an episode. I like that these are casual enough that doesn't exactly matter. Anyway, she reaches for the light and pulls something out of the water. It is a shell, roughly the same size of her palm. So Patron A did not preserve the whole, like, reveal, it's a shell, bum, bum, bum. And that's fine. You don't always have to preserve stuff like that. You know, it's more important that the whole thing overall read well and sound good, even if, like, you might have to sacrifice little things here and there. Yeah, and this is a very, like, solid translation. Everything is there. Patron B. The woman reached out towards the light and pulled something out of the water. That's pretty much exactly the same thing as Patron A, except past tense. It was a shell, the perfect size to fit in the palm of her hand. So this is an example of, like, Patron B was trying to preserve the reveal. Like, it was, drum roll, da-da-da-da-da, a shell. The perfect size to fit in the palm of her hand. Like, and it's not wrong or anything, just punctuation-wise, I think it could use a little reworking. Like, I've been noticing this myself also in my own prose translations, that often, like, when I go back and reread over something I've translated, you know, to fix it and make it sound better, a lot of times I'll find these little ellipses that seem sort of tentative or needless in the English translation, and then I'll find better ways to express it. So it was ... a shell. I don't know, to me, if you're just reading that in English, if you completely forget about the Japanese, if you forget that there was an ellipsis before kaida, and you're just looking at the English here, it almost looks like the narrator is like, it was a shell. I don't know, it doesn't have like a drum roll, bum, 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 especially because it was like, it's at the beginning of like a little paragraphy sentence thing. It's at the beginning of a sentence. So it's just sort of, I don't know, it doesn't, instead of having this like gasp reveal sort of quality to it, it has more of like it was a shell, like you're like trying to remember something. And I guess, you know, narratively speaking, that vibe also works technically, and you'll see why it does work in a little bit. I'm not sure if that was Patron B's intention or not, but yeah, just isolating it in English and forgetting about the Japanese, which is very hard to do when the Japanese is sitting right there. Yeah, it can have that vibe to it, which isn't necessarily what Patron B wanted. A way you could fix that, like just changing the punctuation, not changing any of the words at all, is if you did, it was a shell, M dash, the perfect size to fit in the palm of her hand. That would kind of preserve the whole, like, let's take a breath. We've revealed it's a shell. The reader already knows that, oh my god, shells are extremely significant to this story, to this lore. That's the thing that we learned about in one of the earlier sections, where there's a pearl and there's two pearls inside, and it only appears to women who are truly in love, and then they share the pearls with their beloved, and they're together forever, and it's so romantic, right? Like, the shell is very significant and needs to kind of be a part where the reader pauses. Like, it was a shell. Like in the Japanese, it was a shell was the very, very end of the sentence, so there's a natural pause after that. But in the English, there isn't. Patron A, it's just, it is a shell, comma, roughly the size. But notice how, like, if you add an ellipses, or better still, an M dash after it was a shell, that kind of clues to the reader, like, if you're reading it out loud, you would take a little beat there, a little breath there, and that would give more weight and significance to the word shell. So see what punctuation can do? All right, let's see what small Sarah did. The woman puts her hand into the light. She has taken something from the water. It is something that fits perfectly in the palm of her hand. A shell. Ah, see? That did a really good job at preserving sort of the significance and the reveal of keeping the word shell at the end of this little section here. I don't remember what my thought process was here, because this was, like, you know, over 20 years ago that I translated this. But I very much like this choice that small Sarah did by reworking these sentences so that a shell could be at the end. I think it could still do with some tweaking, like, the woman puts her hand into the light. She has taken something from the water. It is something that perfectly, I think just, she has taken something from the water, comma, or M dash, something that perfectly fits in the palm of her hand, a shell, or something like that. Otherwise, it's a little too, like, clunky sentencey, but I very much like how small Sarah reworked everything so that a shell is isolated by itself at the end. Okay, next sentence. その貝を開くとそこには真っ青な真珠が2つ。女はそれを取り出すと胸に抱きしめた。男が女の名を呼んだ。マトゥタ。Alright, その貝を, so the sono in this case is referring to the woman. その貝, the shellfish in her hand. を開くと, opening the shellfish in her hand, comma, or with, when she opened it in her hand. そこには真っ青な真珠が2つ. Inside, there were 2 pearls of, like, bright blue, or pure blue, or deep blue. Very blue, true blue. 女はそれを取り出すと, she took out the pearls. それ, in this case, is the pearls. 胸に抱きしめた, and she, like, literally, like, hugged them to her chest. Like, she held them dearly to her chest, sort of, that kind of vibe. And then otoko, the man, ga onna no na o yonda. The man called the woman's name, and it's Matuta, in case we couldn't already tell. So it's a man and a woman, the woman's Matuta, and because she found the 2 pearls, we can only guess, okay, the guy who's with her is Ayuru's father. So, Patron A, she opens the shell and finds 2 deep blue pearls. She takes them out and holds them dear to her chest. The man called the woman's name Matuta. So make sure your verb tenses agree. It is the bane of my existence. I'm so bad at that myself. Like, even when I just write straight up novels in English, not translating, I still have problems switching back and forth between my tenses. Yeah, just make sure you stay consistent. It should be the man calls the woman's name. She opens the shell and finds 2 deep blue pearls. Yeah, finds instead of, like, there were 2 deep blue pearls. That's nicer. She takes them out and holds them dear. I really like the holds them dear to her chest. That really paints a good picture. It's like embrace to her chest or hugs to her chest is kind of weird when you're talking about pearls, right? Like, if she held a cat, if she like hugged a cat to her chest or embraced a cat to her chest, that makes more sense. You can actually imagine arms coming around it. But if it's two pearls, it's more like you're kind of clutching the pearls in your hand and like holding them to your chest, but in a very, you know, tender, loving, dear way. So I think that was a really good wording of that. Patron B. When she opened it, inside sat two bright blue pearls. She removed them from the shell and hugged them tightly to her chest. The man called out the woman's name, Matuta. See, and hugged them tightly to her chest. It's very nitpicky. Like, I think metaphorically hugging them tightly to her chest still works. Like, you can imagine she's holding the pearls in one hand and then holding her other hand with another hand and then, like, hugging herself, basically, with the pearls at her chest. You can kind of imagine that as well. I still prefer, like, holds them dear to her chest. Versus hugged them to her chest, because it's like, well, how do you hug pearls to your chest when they're these two little pearls? Otherwise, it's solid. Small Sarah, when she opens the shell, there are two clear blue pearls inside. So we have deep blue pearls, bright blue pearls, and clear blue pearls. None of those are really wrong. Like, maso just means like very, very blue. And you can express that something is very blue by saying it is deep blue, or that it is bright blue, or that it is clear blue. Like, all of that kind of means the same thing. It means they're very, very blue. It just depends on, like, which word you think works better, like, image-wise and vibe-wise. I think deep blue pearls work a little bit better with this vibe, just because it's, like, a very quiet, subdued, nighttime sort of thing. I don't know, bright blue pearls in that case work kind of neat too, because it's shining, so bright makes sense as well. Yeah, I like bright and deep, not clear as much. Taking them out, the woman holds them closely to her chest. The man calls the woman's name, Matuta. Yeah, holds them closely to her chest is good. Alrighty, next line. 女が振り返る。まだ10代の溢れるばかりの若さと美しさに満ちた顔。そして、その愛らしい唇が男の名を呼ぶ。が、口が開くばかりで声が聞こえない。I kept all of these lines together instead of separating them out. So it's a pretty long section, but we'll break it down. So, 女が, again, the woman. 振り返る, she turns around. Remember, she was standing with the dude, and then she walked away from the dude to the lake, so she turns around to look at the dude, because he just called out her name. Mada Judai, so still in her teens. Afureru bakari no, just like exuding, overflowing with wakasa, youth, youngness. So like she's still only in her teens, and she's just exuding and overflowing with youthfulness. To and utsukushisa, beauty. Ni michita kao, so her face is filled with michita, beauty and youth of a girl still in her teens, basically. そして and 愛らしい, so the kanji ai, it just means like love, loving, lovable, dear, lovely, darling, precious. Kuchibiru, so her lovely, her precious, her darling lips. Otoko no na wo yobu, call the man's name. Ga, in this case the ga is however or but. Kuchi ga hiraku bakari de, barely after her mouth opened, or like barely after her lips parted. Koe ga kikoenai. It's like now we can't hear her voice anymore. Like just when her mouth opens to say the man's name, like suddenly we can't hear what the man's name is. All right, so Patron A. The woman turns back to him, her face overflowing with the youth and beauty of a teenager. That's a really good wording of all of that. Yeah, note how the her face overflowing with the youth and beauty of a teenager part is basically that second sentence just completely in reverse. And that's often how Japanese grammar is structured. And I like the choice to put the sentences together. I think keeping them apart would have been fine too for this writing style, honestly, because it's kind of a little more poetic, like short line, short line, short line. Still works. Then her lovely lips call out the man's name, but when she opens her mouth, her voice is inaudible. I probably would have put like a period or an em dash or a ellipses before the but. I think there needs to just be a little more of a pause there. But yeah, otherwise it's pretty solid. Her voice is inaudible. That's fine. Inaudible doesn't sound very romantic or poetic, but it works. And it's a good translation for koe ga kikoenai. Patron B. She turned back toward him. She was still in her teens, her face overflowing with youth and beauty. Her lovely lips called the man's name, yet, though her lips were moving, no sound could be heard. I very much like this second part here. Her lovely lips called the man's name, ... Yet, I love yet, though her lips were moving, no sound could be heard. And I think that's a better description of what's actually happening here. This is very cinematic, actually. I'd say a lot of the narration in this book in general is kind of more on the cinematic side. And yeah, you can totally picture this, like, in a movie, like this scene happening, and then her lips move, and then, like, all of a sudden there's no sound anymore. And you're like, sound, dude, what happened? She was still in her teens, her face overflowing with youth and beauty. That's a nice way of reworking the order of that sentence. So Patron B kept the mada jusai part at the beginning of the sentence. And it works. Small Sarah. I almost called myself Patron C. I do that a lot. The woman looks back at him. You know what? I'm going to add one more note for Patron B. I like that Patron B started referring to her as just she. You know, you can start with the woman at the beginning, but after a while it sounds a little weird in English to keep being like the woman, the woman, the woman. And we're revealing here also that she's in her teens. I don't know. That's like, you could consider a teenage or a woman, or you could also say a girl or a young woman, or it's kind of a vague age range. I like the choice to just use she instead of the woman. Anyway, back to small Sarah. The woman looks back at him. It is the that's so weird. It is the naturally beautiful young face of a girl still in her teens. Beautiful young face of a girl still in her teens. Yeah, it's maybe a little clunky, and it is so weird. Like, she bears the naturally beautiful face, or she has, or hers is the naturally beautiful. It is weird. And her loving lips call the man's name, but when she opens her mouth, no sound comes out. Yeah, I mean, same note for small Sarah as with Patron A. I think there needs to be a bigger pause. Like, her loving lips call his name. This is supposed to be, as a reader, you're like, oh my god, we're finally going to find out who Ayuru's dad is. And then, but no sound comes out. So I think there needs to be a pause there. No sound comes out's okay. No sound could be heard, I think, is the best, versus her voice is inaudible and no sound comes out. I think Patron B's no sound could be heard is better. Okay, now next part. Dare da? Dare nanda? Omae wa dare da? Exclamation points. Otoko ga soko de yukkuri furikaetta. So, dare da? Dare is who. So, dare da is who are you? Kind of demanding. And then dare nanda? It's like demanding even harder. Tell me, who are you? Tell me who you are. Omae wa dare da? So this omae is rude. Depending on who's saying it, right? Omae, it puts closeness between you and the person you're calling you. Between the speaker of the person and you, basically. That's what omae is doing. So if I call my cat omae, it's endearing. If I call my husband omae, it's endearing. But if I call some rando that I don't even know omae, it's rude. Because it's like, I shouldn't talk to this person I don't know so familiarly. It's a little unclear because there's no dialogue tags or quotation marks or anything, who is saying this. My guess, just right now as a reader, is that this is the person who is observing this scene is saying, who are you, who the hell are you? Because there's a lot of, empty space in the book, after this, and it looks a little different. So I think the person who is observing this scene is saying this. So you could interpret that as it's rude, who the hell are you? The man, sokode, at that part of the story, at that part of the scene, when asked that question, who are you? Yukkuri furikaeta, slowly turned around. So we're finally going to we're going to see what this man looks like, maybe. All right, Patron A, who's there? Who are you? Who the hell are you? Exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point, question mark. The man turned his back to her. No, the man turned around. I mean, yeah, technically, the man is turning his back to her, the woman, but more importantly, the man is turning his back to the woman and facing the viewer of this scene. So while it's technically correct that the man is turning his back to the woman, it's more important that the man is turning around to face the person who is watching this scene. The man turned his back to her sounds more like he's abandoning or forsaking the woman because her voice isn't coming out, or something like that. It's kind of hard, right? There's no dialogue tags. This is a weird, surreal little scene. There's some context immediately after it to show like what was actually happening here. But yeah, it's kind of weird and vague. Patron B, who are you? Who are you? I demand to know who you are! At that, the man slowly turned. I like this a lot. I demand to know who you are for omae wa dareda. Yeah, like, you can be rude without using profanity. Not that I'm against profanity. I love using profanity in my translations when it works. We don't know necessarily that it works here, but I demand to know, because that's more the vibe. The person saying who are you here is being very demanding. Yeah, so I demand to know who you are is great. The bolded who are you? I like that as well. And then at that, sokode, the man slowly turned. And yeah, you can tell from this, the man you were looking at the backside of him as the observer of the scene, and then he slowly turned to face you, basically, the person who's observing this. So I like that. Small Sarah, who are you? Who are you? Who are you? Just no change of the way it's worded, even though it's changed in Japanese. I mean, if this were voice acted or whatever, the actor could change their emotion and their intensity with each one of these who are you, and it would work a lot better, but written down, it looks weird. The man slowly turned to face her from where he stood. Nope. So Patron A and Small Sarah just kind of misunderstood. The man is turning in relation to the observer of this scene, not in relation to the woman, Matuta. Okay, next line. Ayuru! And this is in quotes. Haha ni yuri ugokasarete, Ayuru wa tobiokita. Alright, so Ayuru is Ayuru. Haha ni yuri ugokasarete. So, shaken by his mother. Ayuru wa tobiokita. Ayuru like sprung or jumped awake, woke with a start. Patron A. Ayuru! Matuta cried, shaking Ayuru out of his stupor. Startled, he sprang out of bed. He didn't necessarily spring out of bed, like literally. It's more like he sprang out of his dream. Like he woke with a start. Okiru is kind of a weird word, because it does mean wake up, but it also does mean, like, get up out of bed at the same time. So I don't think it's wrong that he sprang out of bed. I'm more just guessing from context that it's more like he jolted awake. Patron B. Ayuru! His mother shook him and he bolted awake. It's more like she was already shaking him. That's a bit nitpicky. It's more like Ayuru bolted awake to find that his mother had been shaking him. I know that doesn't even necessarily sound better, but that's kind of more what the vibe is here. If I read Ayuru and then his mother shook him and he bolted awake, I don't know. I'm probably just being overly nitpicky. Just in the moment right now, I'm kind of seeing it as she cries his name and then she shakes him and then he wakes up, versus she's been crying, screaming his name and shaking him, and only now is he finally waking up. Small Sarah. Ayuru! Ayuru was pulled out of his dream by his mother's touch. No, by shaking him, dumbass. I like was pulled out of his dream, though. Even if it is in passive voice, I like pulled out of his dream. Yanked out of his dream would have been nicer. Alright, next line. どうしたの? ひどくうなされて. So, うなされる, it means like to be, fussy in a dream, to be having a nightmare, basically. It's when someone's tossing and turning and having a nightmare and going, like in their sleep. That's what that is. And then hidoku is like terribly, awfully. And doshitano is what's wrong. Patron A, could you tell me what's wrong? You were crying out in your sleep, Matuta asked. I like you were crying out in your sleep. That's a great, that is what it means, like unasareru. Could you tell me what's wrong is a little, I don't know. Just what's wrong is a little better in this instance. Could you tell me what's wrong? I don't know. That's a little more like polite or something. Patron B, what's wrong? You were moaning terribly. You were moaning terribly. I don't know. It's not wrong. I prefer mentioning the in your sleep. And small Sarah, what's wrong? You were having a nightmare. Now see, this is an example of like, it's technically correct. Like unasareru, it is sort of like to be moaning and crying in your sleep because you're having a nightmare. But like, if you see these two sentences together, what's wrong? Then she's basically answering it. You were having a nightmare. Yeah, or like what happened might also be a good translation for doshitano in this case, because she does know what's wrong. He was having a nightmare. Or like, what happened? You were crying in your sleep. I don't know. I think I'm just being extra nitpicky today. We all did okay here. Next line. Ayuru wa mune wo not mune, just mune. Mune wo joge sase nagara mugon de kubi o furi tsuzuketa. So mune wo joge saseru is to make your chest move up and down, if you look at the kanji. Basically, to make yourself breathe in and out is like literally what that means. Mugonde, silently. Kubi o furu is to shake your head no, usually. And then tsuzukeru, tsuzuketa, continued to, or just kept shaking his head no in silence while breathing. Yeah, and like, while breathing, like, you know, not just breathing neutrally, but like, like that kind of breathing. Because he was having a nightmare and crying out in his sleep and being like, who are you? Oh my, what da. Patron A. Ayuru kept shaking his head silently. After realizing there was no danger, he sat on the floor to calm himself, his chest rising and falling. I think Patron A was trying to make sense of this to themselves. So they added in a bunch of, after realizing there was no danger, he sat on the floor. Oh, and because Patron A had assumed that tobiokita meant like he literally jumped out of bed versus he was jolted awake. So yeah, after realizing there was no danger part was not even in the Japanese. It's not, I don't think it's too much necessarily, because this is kind of what's happening here. I would definitely take that out personally, though. And then he sat on the floor to calm himself. The to calm himself, chest rising and falling is fine, but yeah, sat on the floor is not even necessarily true, because I don't think he literally jumped out of bed. I think he just jolted awake. I like the choice of Iudu kept shaking his head silent. I like the choice of putting that part at the very beginning in response to her question. Patron B. He focused on breathing in, then out, but in response, he shook his head repeatedly. That's a good way of maintaining the word order of how it was in Japanese. He focused on breathing in, then out. For saseru. Instead of like he made himself breathe in and out, he focused on breathing in, then out. But in the response, he shook his head repeatedly. That works. Small Sarah, while breathing heavily. Oh, nagara. Yeah, you shouldn't always necessarily translate nagara as while. While verbing. It doesn't always sound that great, Small Sarah. While breathing heavily, Ayuru shook his head silently. Yeah, and like, note how when you put the adverbs at the ends of both parts of the sentence, it's just kind of sing-songy. While breathing heavily, Ayuru shook his head silently. I don't know, there's no variety to it. It's not wrong, though. It's like, it's a perfect translation of what the Japanese was. It just doesn't sound that great. Let's see. And our last section of this video. Alrighty. Kawaisou ni. Kyou wa hidoi koto ga atta kara. Matuta wa musuko no atama no kizu ni sotto te o yatta. Tanjoubi da toyu no ni. ... So, kawaisou ni, that's a very set phrase. It means, oh, you poor thing, basically. Kyou wa hidoi koto ga atta kara. Something, it was because or since something terrible happened to you today. Like, that's why you had this terrible dream, is basically what she's implying there. Matuta wa musuko no atama no kizu ni. So the wound in his head, in her son's head. Sotto te o yatta, she gently touched the wound on her son's head. Tanjoubi da toyu noni. So this noni ending, I think I did a video on noni, or it came up in some other, one of my grammar videos from the Genki series, I believe. Noni is an interesting one. It's like, A, noni, B, means like, even though A was the case, B, which you wouldn't have expected to happen as a result of A, happened. That's kind of what noni means. So tanjoubi da toyu noni, tanjoubi is A in this case. Like, even though it was your birthday, you would have expected that this would have been a wonderful day and that you'd have a wonderful dream. But instead, B, you had this horrible dream. The B is left out, and it's just this hanging ellipses, which is extremely common for noni. A lot of things will end with noni, and then there's no follow-up. And so it's kind of like, what a shame that this sort of thing would happen, this nightmare would happen on your birthday of all days. Like, this is supposed to be a joyous day. It's kind of the vibe here. Patron A. Oh, you poor boy. So many awful things happened to you today. Matuta ran her hand gently over his head wound inflicted by the Kuto bullies. And on top of everything, it had to be on your birthday. I like on top of everything, it had to be on your birthday. It had to be on your birthday. I like that way of expressing noni. It's like, it shouldn't have happened on your birthday. But it did. So many awful things happened to you today. Yeah, hiroi koto, it's not necessarily an awful thing, right? It is awful things. It seems like, since we've been going over this one day for several months now in these videos, remember, he got bullied by Kuto bullies. He got rocks thrown at him. That's how he got the head wound. And then when Tarya and he came home, like, Tarya's mom was like, you guys have to leave this village or we'll kill you. And you can never see Tarya again. So yeah, this is like the worst day of his life. And then Patron A added, Matuta ran her hand gently over his head wound inflicted by the Kuto bullies. You don't really need that. I mean, again, since we have been working on this for several months, like, we might need that refresher that, oh, right, that's where he got his head wound from, the Kuto bullies. But, like, in real time, the reader reading this read that scene, like, a minute or two ago. So the reader wouldn't have forgotten about the Kuto bullies. So just leave that out. Patron B. You poor thing, you must have been traumatized by what happened today. She touched the wound on his head softly. All the more so because it was your birthday. Ooh, I like the all the more so for noni as well. It's like, not only was it bad that these horrible things happened to you today, but it was even worse because it happened on your birthday, which is supposed to be this happy thing. Small Sarah, you poor thing, it must have been because so many horrible things happened to you today. Yeah, again, just because there's kata at the end, a lot of times Japanese speakers will end something in kata as like, you're making an excuse for the other person's benefit. It's like, I don't know, like if I failed a test and my roommate was trying to console me and she's like, I don't know, she would say something like, oh, you just had a bad spell of luck. She wouldn't say, oh, it's just because you had a bad spell of luck. She'd be like, oh, you just had a bad spell of luck. In Japanese, you'd be like, unga warukata dake dakara. Like, you might add a kara at the end. Like, it's okay. It was just this thing. That's kind of the vibe with kara here. It's not, even though, like, yeah, literally it means because. It was because so many horrible things happened to you. It's really more just like you're gently, like, explaining something and making an excuse for the other person. You're like, I bet it was just because of this thing. You're telling him, hey, it's okay that you're feeling bad because these bad things happened to you, but you don't have to literally use the word because, if you get my drift. Matuta gently touched the scratches on her son's face. Scratches? It's a wound. Like a rock got thrown at his head. But okay. Kizu is kind of vague. Even when it was your birthday too. So noni can be translated as even. But in this case, it's just a little weird. Like it still makes sense, but it sounds a little weird. I like the way patrons A and B worded it much better. Okay, and that is the end of this episode of Let's Translate Light Novels. There is one more episode in December, and then there will be 2 more in January, and then there will be 2 more in February, and then we will be done with this entire series. It's not quite too late if you want to join in and have a chance of translating this series. If you're watching this like as I'm uploading it and not after the fact, you do still have a chance to join my Patreon and be one of the translators for this series. Like, there's still a little bit of a chance for you to join in if you want to. Otherwise, thank you to the people who have been participating, and thank you to my patrons who have been, helping ensure that I actually make these videos. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Greg, Lay, Henry Roaming, and Data Fox.